welcome to Projector. Today I'll be reviewing two films in limited release with unfortunately very few press materials, so I'll be doing them together. The two films I'll be reviewing couldn't be any more different. A Yorkshire farmer returning from Liverpool brings home a homeless boy named Heathcliff to adopt like a son. When the farmer suddenly dies, his thuggish son abuses Heathcliff, who does form a relationship with Catherine, the daughter. When Catherine marries another man, Heathcliff leaves and returns years later to exact revenge. Wuthering Heights is a very strange film to review, really. It's very difficult because it's very art house. It is probably the most art house film I've seen all year, and given that I've seen Melancholia, that takes some doing. In terms of adaptation, I actually think it's probably one of the most faithful adaptations of the book. I've actually read Wuthering Heights, and in terms of actually portraying it on the screen, it's almost spot on in terms of tone. The cinematography with its gloomy, harsh landscapes really gets across the gothic feel of the book. Wuthering Heights traditionally is filmed as a strange kind of romance. This version actually takes the romance into a backseat, and it's more about Heathcliff. It's filmed very much from Heathcliff's perspective. One of the things that this film drops is that it drops the framing device of the novel in that we're being recounted the tale. Instead, we're being told it largely through Heathcliff's point of view. We actually feel somewhat sympathetic for Heathcliff, although I think that's partially due to one element of modernisation that director Andrea Arnold adds, and I'll talk about that later, and the fact that Heathcliff himself is a very ambiguous character, and this is aided by the fact that there is very little dialogue in the film. In terms of cinematography, I think the film is absolutely gorgeous in some scenes. Visually, Andrea Arnold shoots in the 4:3 format. 4:3 is actually somewhat antiquated now, it's kind of going out of use, so to see a film projected theatrically in 4:3 format is very striking indeed. It looks like it's been shot on a prosumer camcorder, and I think the 4:3 camera angle gives it a very enclosed and claustrophobic feel, really internalises the story. There's very few characters in the film, it's very much self-absorbed about Heathcliff and about these characters. At the same time though, the film's too dark. She's trying to go for a naturalistic style, and part of that includes natural lighting. That's the part that really doesn't work. There are scenes where people walk into candlelit rooms and the room is almost completely dark. We cannot see anything in them. That's a bad part of the cinematography. There is some really gorgeous cinematography, but there's some really bad stuff here. There's some awful stuff here. Part of the naturalism as well means using unknown actors, and I can't really judge their performances here because, honestly, again, there's not really that much dialogue, but it's more a film about gestures rather than real performances. And unfortunately, due to that lack of dialogue, if you don't really connect to the movie and you don't really connect to the characters, you really aren't going to like this movie. I can see this movie being incredibly divisive. And to be honest, I sat in the middle of it. I think in terms of tone, it gets across the book perfectly. In terms of character, I think really it's too much of a blank slate for me. It follows the plots of the book closely, but it's very slow and very gradual and progressive. This is a film where images speak more than words. My biggest problem with the movie is its modernisation. And when I say modernisation, I do not mean that she's planted it into a modern day setting. That's not what she does. She actually has a period setting. Again, the camera work kind of makes that unclear because it's so shaky cam and so modern that it feels jarring and out of place. And jarring and out of place is exactly the term I'd use to describe these modernisations. The modernisation that works the best for me is Heathcliff being black. If you've read the novel, he's not explicitly stated as being black. He's stated as being dark, but Heathcliff's true origin, like many things about the character, is left ambiguous. I'm not actually against the idea of Heathcliff being black. I think it's actually an interesting interpretation, but at the same time, it does raise issues in the movie. There's a line, for example, that's taken from the novel about him having an African mother and a Chinese father, which doesn't really work because that line was intended to make the character's origin race specifically ambiguous, Whereas when we can see he's clearly black, that line doesn't make any sense whatsoever. In terms of Hindley's attacks, what it does is it really weakens the character of Hindley, who takes a dislike to Heathcliff, in that it makes his character's attacks entirely racial. Originally, what happens with the character is that he takes a dislike to Heathcliff almost immediately, and it's not explicitly racial so much as about class and about the fact that he feels that Heathcliff is perhaps taking over as a surrogate son. He's taking his place essentially. And in the film version that doesn't come across. In the film version it's explicitly racial, and I think it loses some of the value as a subtext there, in that it makes it entirely racially motivated. And this is made explicitly clear in the dialogue and in the character of Hindley. Hindley is the worst character affected by the modernisation in this version, because what she does is she makes the character a skinhead who speaks in expletives and basically acts, for all intents and purposes, like he stepped out of the movie This Is England. I have really no idea why she tries to implement this idea. It's completely out of tone with the rest of the movie. The performance stands out. I wouldn't call it bad. It stands out because it's completely against what the movie is trying to portray. And when I say expletives, that's the other thing about this modernisation that doesn't work. She inserts in 4-letter words, you know, the F word and the C-bomb in one particular instance. There's a sort of union between Hindley and Heathcliff that I think that was what she was trying to go for. What she's trying to go for is to try and unify the characters. They're both rough in their own respects, and they have, in some sense, a kind of unity, but at the same time, they're against each other. They hate each other, and I think that's what she's trying to get across. And it doesn't work. It really doesn't work. Heathcliff and Hindley are the only ones who speak this way. The worst line in the movie is when Heathcliff is being antagonised somewhat by people of superior class, defends himself, essentially, with a expletive-ridden line that literally made me go face-palming in the cinema, because it's so wrong. It's such a dramatically ill-judged moment that you almost laugh. It's really awful. It's a desperate attempt by Andrea Arnold to get across how shocking the text is. That's my problem with the modernisations. They try to get across how shocking the text is, and they don't work because they jive with the faithful tone of the book that she's managed to recreate. It's a real shame because she's so close, but at the same time, the things that she gets wrong, she really gets wrong, and she ends up making the scope of the issues narrower. The other thing I really didn't appreciate, and this links back to the whole thing about the movie being shocking, is the animal cruelty. I understand that animal cruelty is a necessary element of Wuthering Heights. It's part of the book. But she constantly reinforces it with close-ups. I mean, there's a scene where Heathcliff breaks a rabbit's neck, and we keep cutting back to the rabbit, and I know that Heathcliff is meant to be allegorically linked to the animals, but at the same time, it's really uncomfortable viewing. It feels like she's pushing that into your face, and it's really not subtle at all. I wish that the movie, in some respects, was actually kind of shorter. The movie is 20 minutes too long, and this is interesting because it only covers half the book. A lot of the adaptations of Wuthering Heights only cover the first half of the book. I think there's probably too much material to fit into one movie. Wuthering Heights is probably best served as a mini-series, really. The problem really comes in the second half of the movie, though, because when the characters grow up and they move into their adult forms, they've both become civilised in some sense. They've both moved up in class, and to be honest, these characters are so much more interesting when they're lower class than when they're upper class. They lose a lot of their personality, and I know that's kind of the point, but they're far less interesting that way. And in the second half of the movie, I just felt it was repetitive. I was losing patience with the story. I think this movie is very brave. I think it's very, very brave with the way it tries to reinterpret the text. But I don't think it wholly succeeds. I think it reinterprets the text, but at a cost to the characters, and at a cost to the themes of the story. It's ambitious, but I don't think it will find much of an audience, unfortunately. British breakfast TV is under attack from the mysterious breakfast serial killer who is ruthlessly killing replacement hosts for a morning TV show with Keith Chegwin potentially under threat. It's up to one runner to solve the mystery and woo the female co-host of his affections. When I first saw the trailer for Kill Keith, I actually thought it was a joke movie, and certainly not something I'd actually end up seeing in a cinema if they did make it at all. So the fact that it's actually in cinemas is something of an accomplishment, especially when you see the finished product, because it's blatantly obvious when you see the finished product that it's an independent, literally no-budget movie, and the fact that they've actually made it this far with the project is in itself something of an accomplishment. The way to describe the viewing of Kill Keith is actually to use something of a crude metaphor. If you've ever been to the zoo and seen the monkeys, occasionally the monkeys will throw crap at the windows. That's essentially what watching this movie is like, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, strangely enough. It's very crude, it's almost obnoxious, if not completely, and yet you find yourself very guiltily laughing at it. I mean, the puns in this movie are just awful. I mean, they're so bad, they're actually kind of funny because they're so awful. The love interest is named Dawn simply for the fact they can call the morning TV show The Crack of Dawn. That gives you an idea of the level of humour in the movie. And if that doesn't give you the idea of the humour in the movie, then maybe the fact that someone steps in dog poo about 5 minutes into the movie gives you an idea of just how low this movie is aiming its sights. When this movie's not being incredibly obvious and crude with its jokes, it's weird. I mean, incredibly weird. For example, one of the jokes revolves around C-list celebrity Tony Blackburn, who's not played by Tony Blackburn. I should mention that this is an extremely British film. This is not likely to have an audience outside the UK whatsoever. I mean, if you don't know who these people are, and I saw people who didn't even know what these people are and they live in the UK, then this movie is definitely going to be lost on you anyway. There's a scene where, because the breakfast serial killer could be potentially targeting him, Tony Blackburn, who is not played by Tony Blackburn, goes to a lookalikes agency and picks the real Tony Blackburn as his double, despite the fact he looks nothing like him. And that's who gets killed. The actual Tony Blackburn gets killed in place of the real Tony Blackburn, who is not played by the real Tony Blackburn. Do you see what I'm saying here? That's a really odd gag. I mean, that is the strangest gag in the movie, and believe me, there's a lot of really strange gags. A thing I've noticed in the British film industry lately is that they seem to be impersonating Edgar Wright. Edgar Wright's really whip-pan, quick cutaway style, and to be honest, the only person who's ever succeeded in doing Edgar Wright's style is Edgar Wright. Anyone else just looks like an impersonator. The worst of this is probably lesbian vampire killers, but Kill Keith does have direction that tries to cover up its flaws by pretending to be Edgar Wright. Because the lead character has a lot of imaginary fantasies. I mean, there's one where he's pretending to be Rambo, where he's running through the office. There's another one where he's pretending to be a superhero. There's another one which seems to be purely so he can get Keith Chegwin in bondage gear, where he imagines a gay sex orgy. By the end of the movie, you feel exhausted because there is nowhere else to go with this. It feels overstretched and overexhausted. I kind of wished it was trashier, because when you see the trailer, you think the whole movie's going to be about the breakfast serial killer bumping off British celebrities, and to some extent the movie is about that. But for the most part, it's pushed aside. A lot of it's actually a romantic comedy of sorts, with the murder elements as a background, and I don't think that's really what most people who go to see the movie would be willing to watch. I mean, for a movie that's basically a grindhouse homage about killing off C-list celebrities, there's a comedy horror that somehow is a romance at the same time. I think in that very small niche genre, I think Kill Keith works, but that's not the movie most people would want, and I think it needs to be more consistently funny, it needs to be more consistently focused. The C-list celebrities, for example, like Joe Pasquale, Russell Grant, Tony Blackburn, and Checkers himself, only Checkers himself and maybe Russell Grant have more than maybe 30 seconds of screen time apiece. They certainly know that these people aren't actors. In fact, they're pretty much just, okay, walk them on, kill them, get that over with. And Checkers himself acquits himself well in the role that he's given, but let's face it, none of these people are actors. It's very much a cheesy enterprise. If you're looking for probably a very, very silly comedy to watch when you're drunk, yeah, Kill Keith might just about scrape by. I hope you've enjoyed this somewhat vlog style episode because I have very few clips and press materials to work with. If you didn't like this episode, my apologies. I will be going back to a more normal format next time when I'll be reviewing The Awakening. I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.